And I don't understand why it's got to come down to, an actual battle. This is a very cliche thing in fantasy.
I'm on a journey to create the greatest movie experience in the world. While I'm carving out my filmmaking entrepreneurial path, I want to help you create yours. Let's make some movies. James Martin, everyone. I'm here to help filmmakers to have a successful career, as well as to help your movies become better. Today, I'm doing another Filmmaker Reacts video to follow up from my last one, which, by the way, if you want to check that one out, I'll link it up in the cards up above and in the description down below. Today, I'm reacting to great and worst fantasy movies or TV shows. Keep in mind that this includes live action, animation, anime, cartoons, like any form. And by the way, I'm more judging it based on their world building, how well they create a fantasy world. I'm going to touch on the creation of the movie itself, but overall it's just about how do they create this fantasy world. That's the main thing I'm going to be critiquing on as a fantasy filmmaker. Just keep in mind though that a lot of these fantasy movies and shows are actually based off existing work, like a comic or a book, However, I'm not going to be judging the fantasy worlds based on the original source. I'm only doing it from the perspective of the movie and the show. Alright, so let's get started. Now we're going to check out The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring.
In the lands of Middle-earth, legend tells of the Dark Lord Sauron and the ring that would give him the power to enslave the world. Lost for centuries, it has been sought by many, and has now found its way into the hands of the most unlikely person imaginable. Sauron needs only this ring to cover all the lands in darkness.
What must I do?
The ring must be destroyed.
The ring must be cast back into the fires of Mount Doom. There is evil there that does not.
Okay, so first off, right off the cuff, one of my favorite things about The Lord of the Rings that I think that the movies did really, really, really well is their distinction of worlds, cities, and even races and cultures. Alright, so for instance, like we just saw a moment from the Council of Elrond, where it's basically a group of different characters who are, as a matter of fact, different races, right? We have men, elves, dwarves, hobbits, and a wizard, right? However, you can always distinguish one from the other. They don't all look the same. You know what I mean? Even a dwarf and a hobbit, you can tell the two apart. The elves and the men, you can tell them apart. The wizards and everyone else, you can distinct them apart. When you go into the different cities, the different areas, right? This is good world building, is finding something distinct. That way it makes it easier for your audience, to identify this and that without getting too confused and not getting so overwhelmed. And one of the things I think they do really, really, really well is really pay attention to the culture and behavior of each of those races and cultures, right? So obviously an elf is not going to behave the same way as a man. There's a very unique way that they're going to behave. And I know that the movies do that in a very, very good manner. And I mean, they have like very talented actors. They have Orlando Bloom to be the elf. They have John Rhys Davies being the dwarf. They have Ian McKellen as the wizard, etc., etc. And they just do a fantastic job bringing out these cultures. And of course, the stories are just amazing.
The enemy has many spies. Birds, beasts.
Something draws near. I can feel it.
One of the things I also think they do really, really well too is the music. I love really good music soundtracks. Alright, now, what I think Howard Shore, the composer, did just a brilliant job is, again, using music to distinguish one area, culture, race, whoever, from someone else. Right? There's a theme that you use for Rohan or Gondor, for the Shire, for other places, and it distinguishes who they are. The moment you hear a theme, you know exactly who you're identifying. This is really good world building. Again, it comes down to finding something distinguished, and just the moment you listen to it. And this is the other thing I think the movies do well, not just the music, but just everything about the music. you should be able to look at something, like hear a name, listen to the language, listen to the music, look at art, look at the sets, look at the costumes, and immediately get information, just subtext, just something unconsciously in the back of your mind that's telling you about this person. Right? So the music, I think, does a great job because, again, it has elements like it's got these graceful melodic voices for elves. It's got these strong male choirs, deep voices for dwarves. It's got eerie violin strings for the ring theme. Brilliant.
Get off the road!
Always remember, Frodo, the ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found. Let us hope that our presence may go unnoticed.
Now, something I will bring up about Lord of the Rings that I find very interesting is their use of soft magic. Now, when I say soft magic, this is a term that I just picked up recently, where you've got a magic system, but there's a soft and a hard magic system. The difference is soft magic is just magic that doesn't really have a set of rules. You can't really figure out, how did someone do this? What do the rules apply? Can it refer to situation to situation? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It creates a sense of mystery, but it has to be done correctly. A hard magic system is where there's a very distinct set of rules and very certain conditions in which the magic can apply. It's something where you can figure out, so how does this magic work? What are the conditions? Where can it be used? Where can it not be used? Etc., etc., etc. Lord of the Rings is full of soft magic. You know what I mean? So you look at Galadriel, you look at Gandalf, you can't really tell what their powers are, and even if they use their powers once, they don't really use it a second time. So, again, it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. I personally like it when there's a hard magic system, when there's something that we can all follow, like X-Men, for instance. As much as that's more, fantasy, sci-fi based, at least with X-Men, there's distinct rules, there's distinct, things that some of the characters can do, so we can follow and figure out, okay, they can do this, they can do this, they can do this. Oh, another thing that I really love about Lord of the Rings is when they have monsters, even the monsters have a story and a journey to tell. They have their own motivations. That's the word I'm looking for. Alright, next we're looking at the Nutcracker and the Four Realms. I have to say, though, before I play the trailer, I remember when the movie came out and I actually did go to watch the movie. I just remember as soon as it became an announcement, I knew this was a really bad idea. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Nutcracker. It was actually a ballet. I actually saw the ballet. The ballet is actually really, really good. And nothing about the story whatsoever even remotely comes close to signifying some sort of epic fantasy tale. So I knew this was going to be bad. Just saying, I knew from the get-go this was going to be a really awful movie.
Merry Christmas, Clara.
Godfather.
Your gift this year will be something you'll never forget.
Now, just a little bit of note for those who may not know. So, I don't know how many of you have watched Twilight, which, I could bash Twilight all day. But later in the Twilight franchise, one of the main characters, I think her name is Bella, she has a little baby girl. Well, the actress that played the little baby girl also plays Clarice in the Nutcracker. So basically, it's like the story. It's sort of the story of the Nutcracker, but mixed with Alice in Wonderland. Again, you have Clarice, who apparently is like the chosen one. This is a big problem I have with several fantasies, is this idea of the chosen one. You've already distinguished this main character who is just far special above everyone for no other reason than just they're special. They're the chosen one. They're the returning victorious hero, whatever, right? Everyone's sick and tired of the chosen one trope. You need to have characters who earn their right to be very, very special. And they don't even need to be necessarily special and above everyone else, but they certainly do need to earn their way in order to become someone of significance.
Welcome to our world, the land of snowflakes, the land of flowers, and the land of sweets.
Now, something I will point out as well, now comparing this to The Lord of the Rings, so I remember, as I mentioned before, so the thing that Lord of the Rings does really, really well is it distinguishes not only worlds, races, cultures, etc. However, it even goes further. Every little bit in the story, every little bit that you see in the movie has a story of its own within the main story. So all the scenes, the costumes, the sets, the props, everything, all the artwork has its own story behind it, right? You look at a set and you get an idea of, is it ancient, and how ancient it is, how old is it. I remember watching the Nutcracker, and the first thought that came to my mind was, man, way too much money was put into this. But what I mean by that is there was so much money put into, creating these big sets and fancy costumes. It didn't clarify for me the purpose of it. It felt like they were going overboard for the sake of going overboard. You know what I mean? So you look at, I can't remember, I think she's the Sugar Plum Fairy. I think that's who Keira Knightley plays. And I mean, she might have been great in Pirates of the Caribbean. I didn't really like, the character here. Again, I look at her and I'm confused. So, is she supposed to be magical? Then I want to get a sense of glow. I want to get a sense of a magical presence from her. Again, I'm comparing her to, let's say, Galadriel from The Lord of the Rings. You look at Galadriel, you get a sense of the character is old and she's very magical and mysterious. Automatically. She's just someone covered in purple.
She's gathering her forces.
You're the only one who can stop her.
Hang on!
There always is a great battle in these fantasies too. And I mean, don't get me wrong, don't we all love an epic battle? The problem though is it's cliche. And honestly, the best battles are the ones that are built up. So again, I have to refer back to Lord of the Rings, or even better yet, let's even go to another fantasy series that I love, Pirates of the Caribbean. In the first movie, we don't have a big epic battle. It starts off small. It's a duel between our main characters. It's just a very small fight between, maybe 20 or 30 people. That's it. Nowhere near to a big epic war. This is where I feel that a lot of fantasy tropes really, really fall into the same trap. Build it up. You don't have to go ridiculously huge in the first movie, like building up so we get to know our characters, we understand the stakes, we've come along a journey, and that means that the face-off, the epic battle, becomes that much more significant. Alright, next we're looking at Game of Thrones.
I, Eddard, of the House Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, sentence you to die.
I saw what I saw. I saw in White Walkers.
Alright, so right off the cuff, one of the brilliant things that I really loved about the Game of Thrones show, and I mean, I know that the author, George R.R. Martin, has also commented about the books and the show. It's sort of like a medieval world. And that's the thing about Game of Thrones that I feel is very, very interesting. It's like a medieval world. However, it's got fantasy elements in it. So it's got dragons. It's got these snow zombies. I know they're called White Walkers. There are special spells and magic and all this stuff. However, it's got a grounded sort of medieval feel about it. So we can sort of relate as far as culture goes. We can distinguish a culture, a way people think, right? But yet it's got all these very unique sort of fantasy world building elements. So we know who the White Walkers are.
Lord Eddard Stark, I would name you the Hand of the King.
I have no choice.
That's what you tell your family. Tell yourselves. That's what men always say when honor calls.
This show is a mixture between soft and hard magic that we spoke about before. I love that the White Walkers have sort of a hard magic system about them. So you know what they're capable of doing, you know what they can do, and it's consistent. And how do you take them out is also consistent.
You were never afraid.
There's nothing to be afraid of.
You've chosen your opponents wisely.
I have a knack for it.
The Targaryen girl convinces her horse lord husband to invade. We won't be able to stop them.
The other thing that I feel this show does a really good job at, and I don't know if this is necessarily unique or if it's, based off history. I'm not a historian expert as far as medieval culture goes, but it's got a very consistent culture, and that culture has rules. They define what those rules are. You know what I mean? One of the unique things about the show, the show itself, it's a bit of a political game. But in the show, that politics game is basically between the Baratheon house, where Robert was the last, king of the house. There's the Lannisters, who also want to claim the house for themselves. Robert Baratheon, before he passed away, named Eddard Stark as the rightful heir. So the Starks are technically, meant to be the heir. But before all of them, there was the Targaryens, and they were the rightful rulers for the longest time before Robert Baratheon. So now it's this humongous fight for the longest time between all these different families that are saying, no, the throne is mine. No, the throne is mine. No, the throne is mine. It's a very interesting setup, very different, very, very unique.
Perhaps I was wrong to distrust you.
Distrusting me was the wisest thing you've done since you climbed off your horse.
Getting it honor that's keeping the peace. It's fear. Fear and blood.
My final comment on Game of Thrones 2 is the languages. Again, so we talk about everything's got to have, its own story. Like, as soon as you hear a language, hear a name, see something, it should tell you something about it. It's got a very good language in terms of the Dothraki. They have their own language, and it has a very wild, very harsh sound about it. So you can distinct what that is. There's another language in Game of Thrones called Valyrian, I believe it is. There's Old Valyrian and New Valyrian. And it's got a more richer, a more royal, a more high pristine sound to it. So you get the sense of formality, of royalty. So that really helps distinct certain elements. Next up, we have Disney's Beauty and the Beast, the remake in 2017.
My dear Belle, you're so ahead of your time. This is a small village.
You are the most gorgeous thing I've ever seen. Nobody deserves you.
Now, there's something we gotta talk about the world building in Beauty and the Beast, the remake as far. Again, I'm not talking about the animated movie, and I'm not talking about the original source. Just this movie alone. Now, comparing this to Game of Thrones, it's interesting sort of book, sort of opposite ends sort of thing. Just like how Game of Thrones is sort of like medieval times in a fantasy universe, Beauty and the Beast is sort of like 18th century France in a fantasy universe. So again, we have Game of Thrones, a medieval period in fantasy, and here we have 18th century France in a fantasy world. All right. But there's something that Game of Thrones did right that Beauty and the Beast did not do right. And that is, in Game of Thrones, it still applied rules. There was still a form of realism as far as how you treat people, how you spoke to people, where you would respect someone, how do you react and motivate, etc., etc., etc. Beauty and the Beast doesn't follow those rules. There are certain sort of agendas that try to push certain elements they want to bring into the movie. The problem is they don't fit. So I'll give you an example. So in here they feature a lot of black characters. Now, black characters on their own, great. Awesome. However, in 18th century France, there were no black people. All right, that just didn't happen. There was no diversity as far as types of people in 18th century France. It was just French.
I've come for my father.
He's a thief.
Come into the light. I will escape, I promise.
I will say, though, the CGI in this movie is not the greatest. At least in Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, the CGI is believable. Thank goodness. I mean, even in the Nutcracker and the Four Realms, CGI was okay. It was not the greatest, but it wasn't terrible.
Look, a girl.
Who said that?
Hello.
You can talk.
Well, of course. It's all he ever does.
One of the things I really also like about this castle, again, this is a fantasy castle. So everything in the castle, we can make the exception to the rule because it's fantasy. this is a beautiful castle. I'll give it that mark. I mean, Beauty and the Beast, the remake, in my opinion, it wasn't a terrible, but it wasn't the greatest. Like, I gave it maybe about 5 out of 10. Only, not because it was nah, but because it had a lot of great parts, but also had a lot of really bad parts. But one of the areas I think that he really, really excelled in is this is a beautiful castle. You look at it and just visually it's stunning. It has a sense of just pure magic. And I mean, you know, in fantasy, not everything has to be necessarily real. And we can discuss, you know, does it tell us stories and elements in the story and whatnot. But all I can say is it's visually stunning.
How lovely to make your acquaintance.
Want to see me do a trick? What happens when the last petal falls?
The master remains a beast for it.
Also, one thing they do well in this story and the previous is clarifying the rules, clarifying the stakes. You know, the beast has to learn how to actually love someone because he's a very selfish little and he's got to do it before the last petal falls of this rose. And if he doesn't, then everyone remains how they are. But if he learns to love, if he actually goes through a character change, then everyone goes back to being human.
If she is the one who'll break the spell, you must finally learn to love.
What I really would have loved to have seen, you know, because it's funny, this movie wanted to explore, you know, the Beauty and the Beast story even more. So they added a backstory for Belle. They talked about Belle's mother, how she sort of died in disease, which is a useless backstory that no one wanted. However, what I really would have loved if they sort of clarified a little bit more is the Beast. So how does the Beast react? You know, how does the Beast function compared to a human? I mean, this Beast seems to act and behave the same way as a human. I would love to have seen, you know, maybe in the beginning, a bit of there's a human with a little bit of beast instincts, and the closer we get to the rose petals falling, the more he becomes more of a beast. Like he can't help it. He's starting to walk on all fours. He's starting to growl a lot more. Maybe he wants to eat a lot more. Maybe he starts getting animal instincts, and it becomes harder and harder and harder. That would have been a really interesting sort of like challenge, physical, mental, and emotional challenge for the character. But we get Belle's mother's backstory. I don't know why they chose Ewan McGregor to play someone who's French. I mean, I love Ewan McGregor. I think he's done some great acting. He's definitely a great actor. He's done some amazing work, whether it's Christopher Robin or Star Wars. I don't know why they asked him to do a French role. I don't think his French accent was particularly great. I would have loved it if they got someone else. I mean, there's tons of great French actors out there. I mean, for God's sakes, they got Ian McKellen, who's British, to play Cogsworth, who is British. I will say, though, I remember watching the Be Our Guest number in the theater, and I remember the first and the last part of the number was just magical. It was spectacular. I was glued to my seat just like, oh, wow. But then we got to the middle part, and it was like, eh. I also like the stars thing. I think that was a beautiful addition as well. And yes, we get the Belle Sound of Music moment. The hills are alive. Alright, now we're looking at the TV anime show Attack on Titan.
And just like that, everything changed.
Now, Attack on Titan has a really interesting story setup in the sense that it creates this world, you know, behind these walls, and I don't want to say they're ignorant, but they have no idea what goes on beyond the walls. All they know is that outside of these walls, there are these monsters called Titans. These are human-like monsters. They're sort of small to very, very tall, and all they do is they eat human beings, right? So they're kind of a problem. However, there's a magic system here. It's a hard magic system. However, it's introduced in a way where you sort of get a taste, and then later on it explains what happens. Right? In a very appropriate manner. It doesn't sort of explain everything right from the get-go. It's sort of like, you know, here's a
you slowly get to learn more about this world. You get to learn more about the magic. You get to learn about what's going on, the history, and it just expands very, very slowly in a very appropriate manner. So I think they did that superbly well.
I've waited years to be trained as a soldier. I'm sending the Titans back to hell.
You don't fight the nature of things and win.
You telling me it's better to cut our losses?
Look around you, Aaron. Don't be a pawn.
One of the things I also cannot get enough of is the soundtrack. You know, I love the soundtrack in the sense that it's sort of like very modernized. So, I mean, if we were to compare this to Lord of the Rings is very orchestra. Like, it's a very traditional orchestra type sound. You know, you've got someone like Hans Zimmer who takes orchestra but makes it more, it's less traditional and more modern, but he experiments, he tries new things. This is like a band. It's like an orchestra at a metal band, and they create the music, and they have great themes and great moments for the show, which I just think is brilliant. And again, you listen to the show and automatically you get a sense of what's happening in this world. You can distinguish one world from another. You can distinguish this character from another character, this situation from another situation. I mean, if you just listen to the theme song alone, you do get the strong sense that, oh my gosh, this is going to be epic.
You're loving this art, you little psycho. We're great for this. You know, no, not all of us are suicidal.
I'm also very impressed by this, this fighting system. What's it called? 3D maneuverable gear, or omnidirectional gear, whatever you want to call it. The reason being is because this is the thing you got to understand about a fantasy world. All right. So often when we create a fantasy world, we automatically stick with pistols and swords and bows. That's it. What you have to understand is, in a fantasy world, you're going to start bringing in new challenges, right? So going to Game of Thrones, you have dragons. Well, guess what? There are certain armies that prepared for dragons. So they have cannons. They've got bows and arrows that specifically deal with dragons. In this one, it's got this gear that allows them to not necessarily fly, but move up through walls and buildings and trees, and they know how to kill titans, and they have these weapons specifically designed to kill titans, right? And so it's a system that, there are no surprises. You know exactly how this stuff works, and so you just sort of follow along from there.
Face it, all the powers that be really expect us to do is play the game.
This is our chance! Take out the colossal titan! Remember this moment when you come face to face with it!
What I also really, really loved about this show, and what became very, very addicting for me, is that every single character you meet has a journey. And they have a history, right? So you get to know certain characters more and more and more, and they become believable. They become tangible. They become human beings that we can relate to, right? A lot of times we have these very shallow characters. There's not much that we get to know about them. When you look at these characters in Attack on Titan, almost all of them have had some tragic backstory. Almost all of them, right? Maybe they lost their parents, or they lost a best friend. And it creates a certain sort of, you feel for them, you understand what they're going through, and just the characters get richer and richer, but they have this backstory that when you get to know their backstory, it adds more weight to these characters. It adds more depth. Next, we're looking at the remake of Alice in Wonderland, the remake by Tim Burton.
Alice, meet me under the gazebo in precisely 10 minutes. Alice Kingsley, will you be my wife?
Now, see, something that I wish they did more in this movie, this whole backstory and background, it feels awkward. But, again, what are the rules? What's the culture? Where are they? Is it expected that she should have said yes? Is that why everyone's anticipating? It's like, oh, of course she's going to say yes. And I think I understand what they're going for in the terms of they're making this very sort of bleached out, white, pale world. Then you go into the Wonderland, and it's all colorful and dark and mysterious and stuff like that. But again, I don't understand how this world functions. And so, how do these character decisions play out? What's at stake? Why does she make these decisions? Why do they make these decisions? This is just weird and cringy and awkward.
Oh, that's also brilliant. If you see a rabbit hole, go look into it. Good idea.
There is a place like no place on earth. Some say to survive it, you need to be as mad as a hatter. Which luckily, I am.
By the way, when it says in order to survive it, you have to be as mad as a hatter, that never plays into the movie, and I wish it did. Like, can you imagine if, like, literally the only way to survive Wonderland is you gotta go bonkers? That would have been really something. But no, that's not the message of the movie. I do have to be respectful towards Tim Burton in the sense that, you know, he's got a very distinct eye and he's got a very distinct style as to how his movies function and how he sets them apart. His world building for The Queen of Hearts, to me, is just, it's dazzling because it's scary. Like, you look at The Queen of Hearts, she's got this massive head. Like, she's scary from the get-go. You don't want to piss her off. You know, and Helen Bonham Carter, I think, does a brilliant, brilliant job. You know, so this whole place feels very unique and it stands out to me.
Alice has returned to Wonderland.
Since you've been gone, the Red Queen has taken over all of Wonderland.
Here we go again, the chosen one. Since you were gone. Wait, I was here before? What? What? Again, another big epic battle. This is cliche. There's no weight. We haven't been on the journey long enough to really understand what's at stake here. And I don't understand why it's got to come down to, you know, an actual battle. This is a very cliche thing in fantasy. And that's why I think that you don't have to go the route of a battle. You don't always have to do it. There just needs to be some sort of journey. It could be just, you know, becoming crazy to get out of the world of Wonderland. Like, you got to be crazy enough in order to escape it. That should have been the premise. And I don't understand what Anne Hathaway's character does. I don't understand what's significant about her whatsoever. Alright, so those are my thoughts on some of the best and worst fantasy movies and TV shows of all time. Which is your favorite fantasy movie or show? Let me know in the comments. Let me know some of your thoughts on maybe some of the movies and shows that I presented here. And by the way, if you're interested in seeing me do more react videos to other things, let me know in the comments as well. But if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, please. It helps me to grow and helps me to reach other people. Comes back to help me grow this YouTube channel so I can come back and help you guys even more. Please subscribe, turn on the notification bell. I do post weekly with tips and entertainment just like this one. So, enjoy yourselves. I hope you get a chance to watch any one of these fantasy movies or shows, really, and just enjoy yourself. I'll see you next time.